How's it, folks? Before I get started, I just need to mention that I did receive a free copy of the early access version of the Sanctuary of Sarras DLC expansion for Tainted Grail, and I will be giving away a free code of the base game of Tainted Grail to one of you that is subscribed to the channel and leaves a comment down below in this video. With that out of the way, let's get started on how to actually access the expansion. So if you've got the expansion, there's two ways of starting it. You either have to be in Act 2 and place down a campfire and speak to the person that shows up. Without bringing up any spoilers, there is a narrative reason with why you have to be in at least Act 2 to start the expansion. Alternatively, if you are already in Act 3, you could also start the expansion by coming across a messenger. I'm not sure how you get the messenger to spawn. I was just exploring around the region where he popped up in a random dungeon and threw a fish at my head, and then that started the quest line as well. So the simplest way is to be in Act 2 and plant down a campfire and talk to the person that shows up. Otherwise, do a bit of random exploring in Act 3 and get a fish thrown at your head. That will give you a quest line. The quest line will show up on the map. All you have to do is travel to this part of the map, follow the river down to where it meets the sea, and enter the temple. From there, it's pretty straightforward. Keep moving through the temple. Just bear in mind that these enemies will be significantly tougher than the enemies in Act 2, as the enemies do scale with your character's level. And once you've actually started the main quest line for the expansion, I would recommend continuing, at least doing the first part of the main quest until you get to the central hub zone of the expansion area, as it does give you a new tool that allows you to access certain hidden areas with quite nice loot hidden behind it. I'll go into more detail about that a little bit later on in the video. I did complete this expansion with two different characters. Firstly, my endgame very OP character that was basically about level 97 I think when I started the expansion, and a fresh new character that basically rushed through Act 1 and then started the expansion at a fairly low level just to get a different experience of what it's like. If you take your time, do all the side quests, complete all the dungeons, and listen to all the dialogue, it would take about 10 to 12 hours of playtime to complete the entire expansion. However, if you ignore the exploration, skip through all the dialogue, don't complete any of the side quests, just bum rush through the main quest line of the expansion, you will probably be finished in less than an hour. So the main quest is actually fairly short. The majority of your playtime will be through exploration and completing the side quests and whatnot. There are quite a lot of nice new little tidbits of lore that get introduced with this expansion, but they are heavily involved in spoilers, so I'm not actually going to bring them up in this video because I want to avoid any of these spoilers, because it's quite nice to experience it the first time without it getting spoiled. There is a new progression system as part of this expansion that is tied to your character level, but the difficulty spikes drastically after starting a new game plus. So if you have a in-game OP character, I would recommend completing the main story of the base game and starting a new game plus, rushing through Act 1 and then starting the expansion, because otherwise you're basically just going to hit most of the enemies. Even with the character scale to a level, it's still pretty easy when you've got a proper bold in-game character. Alternatively, if you're starting off with a pretty fresh character, it's still quite low level, you will face quite a bit of a challenge, especially in the first few enemies and boss fights you face. There is a way of reducing the difficulty. There are 6 shrines scattered around the different zones in the map of the expansion that will reduce the difficulty depending on how many shrines you've activated. Those shrines also give you a skill point for the new skill trees that are available as part of this expansion. The skill trees are split between warrior, mystic and rogue, and you can level them up at the same time. If you get, say, 3 points, you don't put 3 points in just warrior. You get 3 points to put in the warrior tree, 3 points to put in the rogue tree, and 3 points to put in the mystic tree. So you can level them all up at the same time. If you find a shrine, you need to activate the shrine to get the point, and then activate it again to actually place the skill tree in its different zones. And if you happen to pick up all the shrines and then go through New Game Plus and then enter the Sanctuary again, those skill points do carry over through New Game Plus. You can keep stacking the Sanctuary buff and flesh out more of the skill trees through various New Game Pluses. And the new skill trees also work when you're outside of the DLC expansion. So if you've unlocked some new fancy abilities in those skill trees, they still work in the base game. Now I am going to briefly show off the actual map. So if you don't want that to be spoiled, just skip this next part. So there is only one fast travel point in the Sanctuary. That's in the starter zone. And that starter zone also comes with the alchemy bench, crafting bench, cooking pot, and a merchant that sells a couple of nice stuff and that you can keep returning to sell off your gear. There is no fast traveling in the actual expansion zones. There are different mini zones that are connected via gateways. In order to access those zones, you do have to interact with the gate and complete a small request. I'm not going to spoil what you have to do because it was actually fun to interact with them the first time yourselves. But you do have to do fairly basic requests to gain access to the different zones. Once you've completed that request, the gateway is permanently unlocked for you. I would recommend you unlock them as early as possible, as they can be used to quickly escape if you're feeling overwhelmed by running through them. And there are some of these gateways that skip intermediary zones, so you can completely skip some zones by going through some of the longer gateways. On top of that, the map of this expansion is a lot more vertical than the base game. There's a lot of different secrets and hidey holes and treasure chests and whatnot hidden away. And if you see steam vents with water shooting up in the air, run towards them, and that will allow you to gain height and reach higher zones, higher areas. Alternatively, if you want to drop down zones, also look for those steam vents that shoot up water, as when they're not shooting up water, if you land on the water that it comes out of, you won't take any falling damage. So they're safe ways to traverse both up and down. I did briefly mention a tool you can earn early on in the main quest of the expansion. That tool allows you to cut these different membranes that hide secret areas with pretty valuable loot hidden behind them, or different areas that give you access to new dungeons. The tool does need to be recharged between each use. There are two main ways of recharging it. Either you harvest these white bulbs that will recharge it. Alternatively, you can also recharge it by defeating different enemies. It's very likely that you'll easily be able to recharge the tool between each use, as there's plenty of enemies and bulbs scattered around the different zones between the different membranes you need to cut. So it's very unlikely that you would actually run out of charges. It's just something you have to be aware of. Other than the main white bulbs that you harvest for the tool that also gives you crafting resources, there are two other bulbs scattered around the different zones. The purple bulbs, if you interact or pop them, will make you drunk and your screen gets all blurry and whatnot. And the red bulbs will explode when you damage them, either by shooting or attacking them. So it's a great way of starting a fight by shooting the red bulbs. That does a lot of damage to nearby enemies, and then you charge them to finish them off. You can also use these bulbs as a good indicator of different areas that you can access, either to get to new loot or to find new dungeons or enemies. So keep looking up every now and then to try and get an idea of places you can jump around to get access to new areas. Alternatively, there are also these massive ballistas that you can interact with that will shoot a giant bolt that will break down some walls to gain access to either new pathways or some hidden loot. So just keep an eye out for whenever you come across these big ballista boys. Another thing to keep in mind is that even inside the dungeons themselves, they are a lot more vertical than you're probably used to from the base game. So look for different pathways you can parkour or jump up that will lead you to new loot or items. Basically just keep your head on a swivel, and you should be able to find the majority of the content in the expansion. Now I did briefly mention this, but the main starter area has a stash box for you to store stuff. But it also has a storekeeper, usual crafting benches, but there are also crafting benches scattered around the different zones. Normally, you can find NPCs that sell new crafting recipes when you're around those new crafting benches, so keep an eye out for that. Other than the main starting area, there is also a second town called Tumbo over in the upper right of the map. I would recommend getting there fairly early on in your exploration because there are a bunch of NPCs with different quests that will send you out to different areas from that area. So I would recommend start heading your way up there when you start off. But feel free to go in either which direction you please. Doesn't make much of a difference. Speaking of Tumbo, it also has the second other stash in the game. I believe only Tumbo and the starting zone area have stashes, but only the starting zone has a fast travel point. So if you're getting close to being overcumbered, you will need to drop down a fireplace, which does actually have a nice new cosmetic change to it. That now that you're underwater, sort of underwater, it's a bit confusing. You will need to drop that fireplace, add the cobwebs, and then fast travel back to the starter zone and then access that stash. So you're not likely to be using the stash in the Tumbo zone. And probably the main way you're going to be making money is by fighting the different fin-blade enemies. They are probably the most common enemy you will be encountering, and looting their weapons and then selling them to the vendors that will allow you to buy their unique items and recipes that they are selling. Speaking of new items, there are about 100 new items in this expansion. I don't think I found all of them, but I did find, when I was going through my inventory and counting the stuff, I did find about 80 odd stuff. So I did miss some items or whatnot. And of those 100 new items, about half of them are new gear pieces. And that's split between the head, gloves, chest piece, legs, boots, cape, jewelry items, the different weapons you'll get. There's quite a nice variation of them. And then a couple of new spells. I only managed to find 4 new spells, which was a little disappointing for my mage character. One of the spells was a water droplet spell that casts water magic that builds up a new status effect called Wet that I'll go into more detail later. There were 2 new summoning spells, one for the new Drowner variant and one for the Fin Blades. And then there was also a new attack spell that you could get from fighting one of the 2 final bosses, but depending on the choice you make, you might not even face that final boss, which means you won't get that spell as a weapon, which means you might only get 3 spells in your playthrough. So just bear in mind, there aren't a lot of new spells added in this expansion. There are a couple of new items that go well with a mage character, don't get me wrong, but in terms of spell count, it is unfortunately quite low. So it does feel a bit like the mages pulled the short straw in this expansion compared to the warriors and the rogues. As there were a couple of new bows that worked well for rogue characters, including a bow that adds a slow down enemy effect, which is incredibly useful. Basically, once I found that bow, I didn't use any other bow with my rogue character, and there were a lot of very nice new items for warrior characters. So much so that I kept swapping between them to get a feel for all those different weapons. But by far, my most favorite is called the Undertow Bloom Gloves, which shoots 6 auto-targeting projectiles after killing an enemy that deals 300% weapon damage. And you can chain these by defeating one monster and then letting the projectiles kill a second monster, which will re-trigger the effect and shoot out another 6 more projectiles, and you can keep chaining that on and on and on. And you can also sort of aim them, but depending on where you're looking at, so you could potentially get all 6 projectiles to hit only one enemy, which should kill off that enemy, making it much easier to chain to the second enemy, and so on and so forth. Those gloves was a lot of fun to use, so much so that once I found them, I didn't take them off for the rest of my playthrough, and you only need 4 spirituality and 4 endurance to equip them. In fact, the majority of the items you can find have fairly low stat requirements. I think the highest I found was something requiring 10 in dexterity, I think. The stat requirements were very low, so you should be able to equip the majority of the stuff you find while you're exploring. There are also a couple of new recipes for different armors, arrows, potions, and food dishes you can craft, with all the resources coming from the new areas you can explore in Sarras. There are also 2 new main container types. There's like these glowing pottery stuff that only contains the new resources that you'll find in the Sanctuary of Sarras. And then there's also these sort of waterlogged moldy barrels and crates that contain stuff that from the base game. So you can still craft stuff from the base game from stuff you find while exploring. However, you can also miss out on some recipes depending on the choices you make in certain quests. It is fairly obvious when this happens, as there are a couple of different quests where you need to make a choice to side with one party over another. There's also at least one crafting recipe where you only get enough resources to craft one of the items, and then you'll have to go through New Game Plus, enter the expansion again, kill that enemy again to craft the second item. So you won't be able to get every single item in the expansion on one playthrough. And moving on to the new status effects, there are two main new status effects introduced in the Sanctuary of Sarras expansion. The first one that I briefly mentioned earlier is Wet, and there is a new arrow type, a flask, a spell, and a couple of gear items, including using a fish as a weapon, that are able to apply the status effect. Wet increases chill build-up by up to 50%, and if you freeze the enemy, the frozen status will consume the wet status and increase the damage you'll deal to that enemy by an additional 50%. Alternatively, you can use lightning instead of freezing to consume the wet status, and that will remove up to 50% of the target's stamina, depending on the damage dealt. Additionally, wet increases chill build-up by up to 50%, which does slow that enemy's movement and attack speed, and when you max out the chill, it will freeze the enemy. So you can dual cast wet on one and freezing on the other to basically stun lock enemies. The second new status effect is called Frailty. It increases the non-status effect damage by 1% each stack, up to a bonus of 66% damage, and each stack lasts for 8 seconds. So basically, each time you hit an enemy, you will deal more and more damage. There is even a way to break an enemy's armor in the new Sarras skill tree by pushing an enemy that has frailty stacks. That will consume the frailty stacks, and if you weren't aware, attacking enemies with broken armor increases your crit chance by 50%. So this makes it very easy to deal a lot of damage very quickly. Both these new status effects are quite nice, and it's possible to make multiple entire builds around each of them. For the next part, I will avoid giving any story spoilers, but I do want to briefly talk about the quests in this expansion. So, you have been warned. The main quest itself is very short, and you'll only really have a choice right at the end of the quest to see one of two different epilogue cutscenes. There are different cutscenes scattered around through the expansion, but you only really have two different endings. And that final choice will have you fight one of two bosses, which will reward you with either a warrior focused set of gear or a mage focused set of gear. Afterwards, you'll be kicked out and have to go through a New Game Plus if you wish to re-enter the Sanctuary and pick up the items you missed in your first playthrough. There are also a bunch of side quests, and a lot of them also have mutually exclusive choices you need to make. The majority of your playtime will involve completing these side quests and the general exploration you will do. And finally, let's talk about bugs and performance. There were a couple of bugs and performance issues that I'm not going to bring up, as they were patched during the week I had early access to this expansion. The only main bug that still persisted by the time I made and edited this video that I noticed involved a couple of missing voiceover lines that will likely be patched out by the time of the official release or shortly afterwards. There were only about 4 or 5 missing lines of dialogues, so it wasn't a deal breaker. With regards to the performance, it behaved similarly to the base game, with it mostly being smooth, with the exception of when a new effect came on screen for the first time, which would cause pretty major stuttering. But if you reloaded an earlier save and redid the fight, it would no longer stutter. Other than that, there is some pop-in when traversing the map, so keep that in mind. And that is it for this relatively short overview of the Sanctuary of Sarras expansion for Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. I personally enjoyed my time with it, and I do believe it is worth the asking price. But I would still recommend checking out different reviews if you are undecided. Otherwise, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Take care, and cheers for now.